Now we'll have to use microphones.
Mr. Chairman, one other question to the planner, Mr. Carullo.
Yes.
Where you mentioned off-site possibilities, should we scratch that from our ordinance completely, not even show it as an option?
We have.
You have?
It's not.
All right, okay. Because otherwise it wouldn't qualify as inclusionary.
Yeah, it does seem to conflict with the idea of.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a good point. I didn't even think of
I mean, it's
that.
inclusionary within the town, but not within
The development.
One thing I noticed on the memo from Inez Associates, on line 55, road is spelled
Yes, I caught
incorrectly.
that too.
Okay,
That's a very unique spelling of road.
yeah. And then another question, because this is Rhode Island general law, do we need to reference Rhode Island general law anywhere in this section of the ordinance here? Because I know we make references to Rhode Island DEM, we make it references to DOH, DOT, so I didn't know if we just needed to include any further reference.
There's no requirement to include a reference.
Okay.
I mean, references can be included, and sometimes they are. I would include a reference if it was a very innocuous statute that no one was aware of, but these general statutes, they're comprehensive zoning statutes,
Sure.
so I think most people would be aware of them who deal with them.
Okay.
Or if it referred you to a different statute, like if we were going from the zoning to the subdivision regulations and referring to that, I think I might include that as a reference, but if it's internally within the zoning ordinance and it's a zoning statute, I personally don't believe it's necessary.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Can I ask a question? The planner. Oh, wait.
Yeah, it's a different ordinance. That's the code. They don't have to change that. Well, we haven't talked about that. What the solicitor is saying is that chapter 108 that's referenced here calls for 20% in any development over 6 units. That's in the Code of Ordinances. It's not in the zoning ordinance. So we were just discussing the fact that we're also going to have to amend the Code of Ordinances in conjunction
To
with
increase
this.
it to
So
10.
they're both the same.
Mr. Chairman, one other question.
Actually, Dr. Roberts
yeah.
is queued up.
Excuse me.
Yeah, it's okay,
Help me.
thanks. I just have a question to make sure I understand the 10% law. Is it such that once a community hits the 10%, then these things no longer apply? I'm just wondering what happens when the 10% is achieved. Because I'm saying that because I've heard, and it's kind of common sense, that that's a pretty low bar for having like affordable housing in a community. And so it's like, once we hit it, it doesn't mean we don't want to have people who would have affordable housing. So I just want to understand that.
Well, so the 10% operates in several different aspects of the law. First and foremost, what it does is any town that does not have 10% is susceptible to a comprehensive permit, which you're all familiar with, which is not what we're talking about here. Comprehensive permit is that when you come in, and now that the law actually says how many units of density bonus you get. It used to be unsaid, and they would come in and argue that whatever the property could support through engineering analysis would be acceptable, and that bonus, and the concept of a comprehensive permit is you wipe off, you put a clean sheet of paper in front of you and ignore the zoning. That's the concept, right? Based upon getting 10%. So if you didn't have 10%, then the comprehensive permit applications are ripe for your town. If you have 10%, then you can reject a comprehensive permit that you don't like because you have that protection. But the 10% is not a moving target with every application. It moves, it's the denominator gets changed once every 10 years. Whenever they do the decennial, so let's just use this example, let's do simple math, because that's not my strong point. If we had 1,000 people, 1,000 pieces of property in the town, and we had to have 10%, 100 to satisfy the law, that 1,000 number does not change for 10 years. So every time you're adding more units, it's not like we got 1,010, 1,005. No, it's the 1,000 stays fixed. Then 10 years later, the denominator gets changed. If you have now 2,000 units, then you're going to have 200. So to your point, there is a sense that it's growth, but it's not like growing by, every time you add a house, that bottom's growing, that denominator's growing.
At what point do they set that bar for the next 10 years?
They do it every time they do a decennial, every time they do the census.
2020, 2030?
Right, as soon as they do they just did the census just recently, a couple of years ago. Now that 10-year number, whatever your number is now, remains fixed. So any town that's meeting their 10% has the protection to say no to a comprehensive permit. Does that make sense? If you don't like where it's going. But if you don't, the law says you gotta let them in.
Okay, all right, that's really helpful, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, question for perhaps the solicitor. Is there a move afoot at the state level to change the 10% to maybe 11% at some point?
I haven't heard it, but I think based upon the dramatic amount of legislation that we saw, what they did, they didn't increase the 10%, but by mandating the amount of affordable housing bonuses you get. For instance, if you've got 100% affordable housing project, 100%, you get 12 units in addition to every unit you can do by zoning. So my zoning, your zoning would allow 10 units by regular zoning. Multiply 10 times 12, that's the minimum bonus that they get.
Wow.
So they may not be increasing the percentage as to the 10% to 11 as far as meeting that, but very few towns are like, I gotta be honest with you, most towns, this law came into effect in 1991, and after 30 years, there's not one town that has satisfied the 10%, except the cities that already had it, like
Yeah.
Providence
Yeah,
and
sure.
maybe Warwick, maybe.
Walton's exempt, West Walton's
Right,
exempt.
they're exempt. But no other town is even close. We have done much better in our town here than in East Greenwich, Lincoln, Smithfield, all those towns, because they have not even gotten close. The last recall with Lincoln, it's been 30 years, and Lincoln's number of affordable housing, I think it went up like 25 units. So, to your point, that's why the state legislature put the law in place to say there's a mandatory 12 units per acre if it's 100% affordable. If it's 50%, it's less. If it's 20%, less. But they're mandating the amount of bonus because cities and towns would always fight those bonuses as being infeasible based upon the environment, the engineering aspect of it. But if an engineer comes in and tells you the property can support it, you could not say no to 12 units bonus in any zone.
Well.
And it has to be consistent with your comprehensive plan.
Right.
You do a much better job in this town of looking at your comprehensive plan, making it make sense, setting a future land use map. So you do have that defense. So there's two defenses, right? That defense is, we got 10% already. Defense number two is, where you want to put it is not a location that we've identified on our land use map. And that has succeeded in court all the way.
Even though they just changed the laws recently to allow
Well,
for.
now we're really shaking that out now.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
that's a very good point, VP. We're gonna shake all that, but I'm just talking historically.
Okay,
not
okay.
this. But you understand there's a tremendous amount of pressure on all the cities and towns now to, not just do affordable housing, but to grant developments and zoning relief, as you know, with much lesser standards.
So,
Does
what,
that make sense?
Yeah,
I'm
but
trying to get on a little bit of a tangent, I didn't mean to do that.
It concerns me though a little bit, because we're talking about housing units, and like, while we can talk about condos and apartments, that's not a problem, but if we're talking about a 1 acre piece of land and they wanna put 12 houses on it now, that's, life safety is,
But
is it?
I'll just say this to you, VP.
Yeah.
The reality is that developers, affordable housing with single-family residence really doesn't work.
Mhm.
It's not economically feasible for the developer. Affordable housing works with condominiums, works with apartments, that's what it works with.
Mhm.
So all of a sudden, I'm building a condominium, and I get 120 units bonus on my condominium. I'm gonna have, a lot of that bonus is market value condominiums. And the affordables have Formica, and the non-affordables have granite.
Yeah.
That's how they do it, that's the dynamic. Or if it's 100% rental, like a lot of the, there's a lot of projects out there like, that get federal grants to build a 52-unit project for senior citizen housing. I'm sure the planner's familiar with that. It's like a cookie cutter project. The federal government gives you, back when it started, like $5 million to build a building, and it's 100% affordable for senior citizen housing. Normally, the federal money normally is senior citizen housing and disabled. Those are the two major buckets of federal grants out there for affordable housing. Does that make sense? Everybody thinks affordable housing is Section 8.
It's not.
It is, but it's not really what we're talking about here.
Right.
So, did I answer your question?
There's a lot, this is a big learning curve.
There's a lot in this.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here, and just to get back to the point, this is a choice the town doesn't have to do. But towns do this because they're saying, if you're gonna come in on our town and put 10 new units in there, we want you to have, well, I guess it's 15% now, but it would be,
But ours is gonna be 20.
Yeah, we're
I'm going
moving.
to 20%. So we want 2 units that are gonna be affordable.
Yeah.
And that's, that's good. I mean, I know that a lot of developers will constrict their projects. I know, it's supposed to be 6, and they say, oh, I'll make it 5, because I don't want to trigger the affordable housing. So this will keep projects from steamrolling in that are over 10, unless they really can afford to support the affordable housing aspect. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's what inclusionary zone helps you with too. It helps you force affordable housing and might ultimately keep a project smaller because somebody doesn't want to put affordable housing in it. Think of if I was going to do 10 lots and I was going to build $1 million houses, I'm going to do 9.
Right.
Because I'm not going to sell $1 million house to somebody for $250,000.
But practically.
'Cause that's what I'd have to do.
If you're gonna do 350.
You'd get the benefit of buying my $1 million house for 200, because it's gonna look like the others. It can't look like, you can't have an affordable house over there down the corner. It's gonna be the same house. So you can see, if I was doing a really expensive subdivision, nobody's gonna come in more than 9.
But it's not targeted at that.
Say again?
It's not targeted at that, though. The whole idea is, it's targeted.
To
at
encourage
people-
it.
To encourage people to be able to go from having an apartment to having a house and all that kind of stuff. First-time homeowners, that kind of thing. And they're not at the income level that would support even an $800,000 house in a $1 million development, right? So I
You're
think you
not
have to
gonna
worry
see
about that.
affordable housing
Yeah.
in single-family houses. That's just not where you see it. 'Cause
Yeah.
you can't build a house cheap enough with the land to meet that requirement. You can do condominiums, and theoretically,
Well, there's,
you might
you
be,
have quantity there.
you might be breaking even on a condominium on the affordable unit. You get close to breaking even because you're building a whole building off them, things that kind of,
Right.
that nature, which is never on a single family, just because of the lot. The lot's worth $200,000 or $300,000, now you gotta build a house. The cheapest house, another $200,000 or $300,000. There's no affordable houses that are being sold for $500,000. Inclusionary zoning is a good tool.
How does this affect us on a project that was in front of us in the past, like Rankin's Path? That's gonna be 200+ houses, but done in segments.
Rankin should be, well, because it's a project, that project would be grandfathered in because it's already.
Okay, sorry, so that has no, okay.
A point of order, I don't think we can discuss
Yeah.
a
shouldn't be
project
mentioned any
when it's not on the agenda.
Right, yeah.
Sorry.
Particularly a project that could come back before us. So any other questions for, on this topic before we make a recommendation? In which case, I'll be looking for a motion and a recommendation.
I'll make a motion that we make a favorable recommendation to the North Smithfield Town Council based on the planning office's recommendations.
I'll second it.
Finding that it's consistent with the comprehensive plan, is that gonna be a second motion?
That's in the findings, so if you,
That's in the findings.
Yep.
So
That's fine,
it's an inclusive motion.
that's fine, those are the two things you're indicating to the council, right? That you
Yes.
support it, and it's consistent with the comprehensive plan.
And I'll second that.
Dr. Roberts seconds. So roll call vote. Dr. Barone?
Yes.
Dr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Porter?
Yes.
Ms. Menard?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes.
The second item that we're here for tonight is the medical marijuana and retail cannabis. As the planning board, most of the members may know, back in 2022, I think, there was a referendum for the community, and it passed to allow retail marijuana in the town of North Smithfield. I think the vote was like 60-40. And the General Assembly passed a statute that says you shall have a referendum in your community. If your community votes in favor, you shall adopt an ordinance. When that referendum passed, the planning office went back at the recommendation of the planning board and drafted a draft retail cannabis ordinance. That was back in 2022. We brought that ordinance before the planning board at the time, received many comments on that, and incorporated all of those comments into this document. These documents are fairly long. What we did also at the same time is when we went back and looked at the medical marijuana ordinance for any inconsistencies with the statute and any mistakes that existed in that ordinance, and we resolved those issues in this ordinance. For example, in the prior medical marijuana ordinance, they separated card holders and caregivers, so that if you're a card holder and you have medical marijuana prescribed, you can grow marijuana in your home. However, if you're a caregiver and you provide marijuana to a card holder, they separated that out, and they weren't allowing them to grow it in their home. That is against the statute. A card holder and a caregiver are the same because they both hold cards, and they have the approval to grow marijuana in their home. And that's one of the things that we straightened out in the ordinance, where we call them card holder, caregiver. That's just one of the things. I don't want to go through all of them because it wouldn't make a lot of sense. Again, what we also did in the use table, the marijuana and cannabis categories were spread throughout the use table. There was some in the agricultural section, some in the commercial section. There was going to be some in the retail section. So rather than doing that and forcing people to go through, we created a new category in the use table called medical and recreational marijuana, and we combined them all into that section of the use table, so they're easy to find. So if you're looking for marijuana, you look in one section, and they have retail sales of cannabis, testing laboratories, compassion center, and medical marijuana, card holder, caregiver, and licensed cultivator. Those are all included in one section of the use table. We did go through, and some of the questions we had at the time was, where should we locate the retail marijuana and the testing laboratories? And we concluded that they should be special use permits to go before the zoning board. And if it's going to be a development project, those special use permits will be coming before the planning board under the Unified Development Review. My assumption is they'll be locating in existing plazas and existing buildings, so they wouldn't be building new buildings for this. But in any event, we are allowing the retail sales and business highway, limited commercial, and the manufacturing zone all by special use permit. Testing laboratories, the same. For the board's information, the General Assembly broke the state up into regions. I'll call them regions. And North Smithfield is included with, I think it's Lincoln, Cumberland, not Smithfield, Cumberland, Gloucester, that's in Burrillville. And the regions are only authorized to have, I think it's 3, it could be 2 retail sales of cannabis. So among 4 or 5 communities in North Smithfield's region, only 3 will be licensed by the state. So we may have someone apply and come to North Smithfield, we may not. But in any event, we're required to do the ordinance. We had this before the planning board back in 2022, and this is the ordinance that's resulting. It's fairly long and detailed. If you have any questions, we can respond to those questions, but it would be very difficult to go through, well, it'd be long to go through this point by point. We did look at distances from schools, recreational areas, churches, things like that, distances between retail sales. So pretty much the distance is 500 feet and 1,000 feet from 1,000 feet from schools and playgrounds and recreational areas, 500 feet from, I believe it could be 500 feet from churches. Yeah, it's 1,000 feet church, public park, playground, youth center, licensed daycare, et cetera, et cetera. That's 1,000 feet. And I'm wondering, I can't remember what the 500 feet was, but in any event, hours of operation limited to 8 to 8 p.m. Weekdays and Saturdays, and 12 to 6 p.m. on Sundays. And there are regulations that were created by the Department of Business Regulation. I think they still are the ones that control the cannabis and retail marijuana licenses, and all of those requirements that they include for someone to apply for permit to the state are also included in our ordinance.
Question. For the use table on page 4 and 5.
Yes.
I'm assuming the Y and the N are yes and no, but I don't know what S means.
S is the special use permit.
Oh, okay.
So,
Thanks. Okay.
under the new statute, in order to have a special use permit, you have to have specific objective criteria to be reviewed, and if someone meets the specific objective criteria, they're allowed to have the use. And if you go through the ordinance, you'll see there's a whole section where there's specific objective criteria that they would have to meet, including license from the state, hours of operation, security requirements. I think there's air filtration requirements, so that the smell doesn't emanate into the neighborhood and around other businesses. So there's a whole litany of requirements that someone would have to meet in order to qualify for the special use permit. However, if they meet those, they're allowed to establish the use.
Thank you.
Any other question, comment, Mr. Miller?
Hypothetically, if we had issued an establishment, and we have one of those in town, and the criteria is, they have to be 1,000 feet away from, and now somebody comes a year, 2 years later and wants to put a daycare, are they gonna be restricted because of that 1,000 feet?
That's probably a question better for David, but I believe if you bring if you come to the nuisance, for example, That's on you. So if a day,
Okay.
at the time of the permit and the time of the approval,
All right.
they have to prove. If someone tries to move in after that, there's no prohibition, I don't think, David, from a daycare moving next to one, but there's a prohibition for someone to applying for one next to a daycare.
Yes.
It's called coming to the nuisance under
Thank
the,
I love the phrase, coming to the nuisance. Any other questions or comments?
Mark answered all my questions when he was explaining everything.
when we went through this in 2022, one of the members, I believe his name was Mr. Porter, had a whole
Oh, he's bringing the receipts.
had a whole sheet of comments, and they've all been incorporated into the statute, not into our proposed ordinance.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And then all the comments too that we had that night.
Yes, I
Perfect.
Remember that night?
Yeah. All right. I will make a motion for a positive recommendation to include, to the town council to include the planning department findings for the updated zoning for medical and recreational marijuana.
Okay, we have a motion, do we have a second?
I'd like more discussion.
Okay,
Am I out of order asking for further discussion
I think after a second, you have discussion.
after the second?
do we have a
If there
second?
is.
Second.
We have a second, okay, discussion.
We are being asked to certify that this is in the best interest of the town's health, safety, and welfare. That's what this board is charged with. We have heard no evidence whatsoever that marijuana is safe, that it's not addictive, that it's not a gateway drug, that it doesn't lead to mental problems and considerable health issues. And I cannot, in good faith, certify that this is going to be in the town's best interest of health, safety, and welfare. That's all I have to say.
I'd like to ask the solicitor a question based on what you just said. Where the town has voted on a referendum, how does that impact what Dr. Benoit just brought up?
It trumps it.
That's what-
When the citizens of the town, when the citizens, they didn't have to put this on a ballot. The towns put this on a ballot if they wanted to get some of the marijuana money. So if you put it on the ballot, you get the marijuana money, and if it passed, you have to create this ordinance.
Right,
You can't say, oh, I wanna have the money from the marijuana, I don't want the possibility of having a retail marijuana facility in my town, but I just want the money. The state said, no. You want the money, you gotta do a referendum, and if the referendum passed, you have to do this ordinance. If you don't do this ordinance, they're gonna come and get it, and then now they will file an application to put it next to a daycare. So the list of your conditions in that ordinance are the list that comes primarily right out of the state law that says, this is all you can limit. Like, you can't make additional standards. That's the list, the standards that are in there.
From like the FDA.
So again, Dr. Benoit, I appreciate and applaud your point of view, but when the population of North Smithfield voted to adopt that referendum, it's forcing this to happen.
They were, basically, the townspeople were saying, we're willing to take that risk.
Right.
I understand. I'm not willing to accept it.
That's okay, that's fine,
That's all. And back in 2022, I think I may mention that
Oh,
I wasn't quite happy with the referendum.
You did, sir,
Yes, sir, I remember.
and
You were on
you're
that?
entitled to vote your conscience.
I do that.
Okay. Any further discussion before we vote? Okay. With that, we'll vote. Dr. Benoit?
No.
Dr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Porter?
Yes.
Mr. Menard?
Yes.
And the chair votes yes. Thank you.
Quite all right.
So, that brings us to item 9, our administrative subdivisions. Mr. Carrillo, you want to Bobby, do you want to just take us through the administrative subdivision?
So you all got a copy of this, right? This was just an adverse possession where Lot 59 had to give up 1,000 square feet to Lot 155. It's pretty cut and dry.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't affect any minimum zoning or anything like that, right? Minimum lot size?
So it increased an undersized lot,
Oh,
which is the lot, the 16,000 square foot lot, received 1,000 square feet. This was an adverse possession case. It went to the Superior Court, and a judgment was found where it awarded that property to the abutting property. So
okay.
in order to do the transfer, they have to record an administrative subdivision. So, you know, it's pretty much a ministerial act, and the court ordered it.
Gotcha. Any
Well, thank you.
questions on that? Okay, that's great, thank you. And with that,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
motion to adjourn? Second?
Nobody wants to?
Second.
Here we go.
I was waiting for Doc.
Usually it's so fast. Those in favor of adjournment?
Aye.
Opposed? Hearing none, we are adjourned at 7:48.